We are ready to get rolling. I want to welcome all of you who are logging in. We see people from at least 3 states, if not more, and we will get more online as we post this. We are glad that you are here with us tonight. This is the Waypoint 55 webinar series that we started more than 4 years ago to try to provide resourcing and support, training for ministry leaders in the church and in a variety of ministries that you may be serving in at your church, whether that's elders. We do a couple a year for elders, or prayer team leaders, mission team leaders, if you're a volunteer youth leader or children's leader, and first impressions, guest impressions, ministry, but the topic tonight that we have that we're going to be covering is safety and security, and we got to be careful how we apply that we've talked about in previous webinars. But at least once a year, if not twice, we'll do a webinar about your safety team at your church. And so, as always, we want to give special recognition to our platform sponsor, Mid-Atlantic Christian University, and who has been our sponsor since we began this series more than 4 years ago. And we serve a similar group of churches in a similar region in the Mid-Atlantic states. And so we're very thankful that they provide the funds for our webinar platform every month. And I mentioned that we've got a whole host of webinars. We've got a YouTube page that we would love for you to subscribe to. You can find it at Waypoint Church Partners on YouTube. And then if you hit the little bell, you can subscribe to it so that that'll start coming up in your feed, in your YouTube feed, in your algorithm. But you can also hit the bell on there that you'll be notified when a new video is posted to our page. And so we post at least once a month, and they are organized. Number one, you can just do the whole list of all the ones that we've done the last 4 years, but you can also look at playlists, and they're organized by topic. And so we've got a playlist just for safety and security teams, or just for elders, or just for missions, or just for prayer teams. So we'd love for you to subscribe to that, and also recommend that particular prayer topic to another leader at your church that is serving in a different area, that they might not know that we've got resources where we might be able to help support and empower their leadership of their ministry area. But tonight, what we are talking about, we're talking about not this one. This is the last one we did with Phil, who is our presenter tonight. A year ago, we did the art of de-escalation. And after the fact, we've had, I checked this afternoon, 130 plus people, leaders, have watched that over the past year after we did that live last March. And so we hope that you come back and use this YouTube page as a resource to you and all the other leaders in your church to help provide some just real practical tips on how to lead the area of ministry that you're called to at your church. And so tonight we've got Phil Murdoch, who is going to be presenting for us. And Phil has presented a year ago and on other webinars as well. Phil's leading the LifePoint Christian Church in Toano, Virginia, which is near Williamsburg, just north of Williamsburg on the peninsula. And that's one of our church plants that launched 16 years ago. Is that right? Just finally got into a building a little over a year ago, and has seen just great growth coming from that. Phil has an interesting story, not only leading that church as the senior minister. I've got a picture here that Phil does not know I'm going to show. So I didn't ask his permission, but the 2 areas of his life, 3 areas would be his family. I don't have his kids and wife there, but this is the equine facility that they purchased and then retrofitted into a church facility. So that's what he does as a minister. But then he's also fire chief at the local fire station there, not too far actually from their church building. And so Phil, welcome to our webinar tonight, but I'm curious if you want to tell us very quickly how you came to combine both ministry and firefighting. That's not a common thing for a preacher to be a firefighter, and how that all happened, and then how you went through the ranks up to your final position before you retired.
So I worked, I saw somebody was on here from Ridgeway. I worked in Martinsville, Virginia at the Rich Acres Christian Church back in 1999, I believe it was, when I first went there, and loved that area. But being a guy from the coast, it was a little bit of a hard area for me to adjust to. And long story, but I met a group of guys that were firefighters, and they invited me to come to the firehouse. And I thought, that's not really what I'm interested in, but I had nothing else to lose. I needed friends. So I went to the fire station there in Martinsville, volunteered for a while. Then they were hiring some guys to come on to their staff at the firehouse, at the fire department. And I took the opportunity and did that. Meantime, went through lots and lots of fire academy classes, emergency medical certifications, National Fire Academy, things like that. Moved out here to help plant LifePoint back in 2006. There's one of the largest combination fire departments in the state of Virginia. It's just down the road. Started serving there, kind of through the ranks. Ended up being the fire chief there, stepped down from that a couple of years ago. It's time to retire. We were moving into our first church building. So I was trying to do that, and just had a lot of other opportunities as well, working with, Department of Homeland Security and some other agencies over the years. So it's been fun. I've had these two lanes of ministry and emergency management, and both have been a ton of fun.
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting knowing that how you've had to outfit your building, having been a church planter that outfitted a building. We never wanted the fire chief to show up and inspect anything when we were, and so you were the fire chief building out a building. And so cutting corners and hiding anything that wasn't good probably didn't happen at your building. So it's interesting that you were playing both roles, wearing both hats as you were building out your building and going through all that. And so, but it's interesting that you said emergency management, because as a firefighter, most people think it's, climb the ladders into a burning building, but the emergency management is really what we're talking about tonight, is when there's some kind of medical emergency at your church building, are you prepared to respond to that in a timely manner and in a proper manner? And most churches haven't thought through having just a simple but defined plan on what they're going to do, and even thought through what kind of things could happen. And you and I, and we've talked about this in previous webinars, like that you would find in the playlist there. But you can go to conferences for safety and security, and the one thing that happens the most often is the one thing they talk about the least, which is a medical emergency is more likely to happen at your church than any other kind of incident. And all the conferences that you go to, they want to talk about active shooter or active disturber, all these kind of things that make the news. But to be honest, the odds of someone having a heart attack at your church, or some kind of seizure at your church, or some kind of other medical emergency are way higher. And we don't have a plan for something that we can actually can control and have a plan for us. That's what I'm going to ask Phil to share with us tonight. And for those of you who are joining the webinar, might be new to the webinar platform, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your page. It's different from the chat button. The chat allows everybody to kind of interact with each other, but the Q&A button allows you to ask a question to the presenter. It puts it in a queue that he and I can both see. And then if we can answer it relatively soon within the flow of the conversation, we'll try and do that. We might be able to answer at the end of our session tonight. We do these topics in 55 minutes or less is the promise. We've only gone over one time in 5 years, and our presenter wouldn't take a breath at the end of his presentation for me to say, oh, thank you very much. So it was not you. Actually, last year's was 53 minutes is the length of that video. So we try and do it in 55 minutes or less to just give some encouragement and empowering and training for this area. But if you have a question for Phil, what I want to encourage you to do is to hit the Q&A button and type it out as soon as you think of it, so you don't forget it. And it'll be in the queue, and we will either answer it then at the end of the session, or we automatically get an email that's generated to us of all the people that ask questions. And so if they weren't answered live, we can follow up with you over the next day or so to try and answer your question individually via email. And which is one of the benefits of coming onto it live rather than watching it on demand after the fact. And so hit your Q&A button if you've got a question for Phil. You will be able to see in a follow-up email that is generated automatically by our interface tomorrow that will include Phil's email. If you've got a question that you don't think of till tomorrow, you can ask him a question about safety or security or anything like that from the email that you'll get tomorrow from Zoom, the Zoom platform. So that being said, Phil, why don't you just kind of dive in? I'm going to run the slides for Phil, but dive into, introduce the topic of medical teams. And it's been encouraging to me. This was happening pre-COVID, but I think for some reason it was something that during COVID, we had time to figure some stuff out. After we figured out streaming, then we weren't doing anything else. And so as I visit a different church, practically every Sunday, I'm seeing more and more churches that have obvious medical teams in place. And it's still not the majority, but pre-COVID, it was a couple or three a year. And now it might be one a month that I'm seeing that have, you can tell walking around the building that there's a medical team that has been recruited and empowered to do their thing. And so if you'll kind of walk us through kind of the why of that and the how, that's what we want to get into, and people can ask questions as we go.
Sure. So before I jump into things, one of the things I want to explain is sort of echoing a little bit of what Tim said. I have a chance fairly often to talk with and to coach churches in these areas. And one of the things I find is that most of the conferences, this is sort of my soapbox, the conferences and the training that's out there, there's a lot of training in active shooter, active disturber, give it whatever definition you want. And let me just be very clear. Everyone needs to have a plan for those situations, but I'm not the guy to teach that. There are plenty of people out there that are really good at that sort of thing. But what I focus on is sort of the more practical and more high probability, high frequency events, and giving just sort of practical solutions to helping you in those areas. For those of you on here, you may or may not know this, people think in the fire service that basically every time the fire trucks leave the station that we're going to go put out a fire. And that's just simply not the reality at all. That sort of gets all the attention, is going into a house and putting out the fire. And for most guys and gals who got into the fire service, that's the thing that sort of entices them, that sort of high energy, high adrenaline moment. But there's lots of other calls that you have to prepare for, not just the big one that's kind of out there that everyone knows about. I mean, there's car accidents, there's elevator rescues. Someone gets stuck in an elevator, you call the fire department. But what most people don't know is that somewhere between 80 and 85% of all calls that come into fire stations, especially if they have a rescue or medical component, 80 to 85% of those calls are medical in nature. So every time you hear that fire truck or see that fire truck going by, you probably assume they're going, to put out a fire. It's not the case. 8 out of 10 times, they're going to a medical call, because that is the most common emergency that we have in our community. And it is the most common emergency that you will have in your church services or events that you might have. So I say that for those of you that are on here, if we're leading in our churches in whatever capacity, we have a responsibility to take care of our people. We have a responsibility to be prepared, not just again for the active shooter sort of situation, but to be prepared for what is kind of the high likely situation. In emergency management world, we sort of break down events. There's some different names you'll hear for this, and Tim will throw a slide up there for this, is frequency and impact. Frequency being how often does this sort of emergency take place? There we go. Frequency and impact. So frequency is how often do you expect, or can you reasonably expect something like this to happen? And then impact is when it does happen, how large of the impact. So I just listed some things here just that you might experience in your churches. So like a medical threat, that's a high frequency event when compared to all of your other emergency events. Its impact may not be as big as an active shooter or a structure fire, but it can be. But it's probably more of a scraped knee, sprained ankle. We'll talk about some of those things in a minute. And here's some other things like severe weather. Do you have a severe weather plan? If not, you should. The frequency of that may change. If you live out in the Midwest, sort of like in the Joplin area, we went out there for a tornado. That's probably more of a high frequency there than it is in Williamsburg, Virginia. Active shooter, that's a low frequency event. Highly unlikely. Should you be prepared for it? Should you have a plan? Absolutely. Is the impact high? Yes. Missing child, burglar, vandalism. Actually, burglary and vandalism of churches, that's very high in regards to insurance claims for churches. It's usually either one or two. So it's a medium frequency and it can have a pretty significant impact. So, and then the last column there you see is vulnerability. One of the things that we encourage churches to do is do a risk assessment and figure out what your high frequency, most likely events are, what that impact would be to your church gathering, and then what's your vulnerability? Are you prepared for this? And if not, what can you do to better or to lower your vulnerability in those situations? So you may hear me from time to time mention frequency and impact. So we're going to talk about medical emergency, which is the highest likely emergency event of all the reasons you will dial 911 in your services or an event in your church building. This is the highest. In fact, if you've been at a church for any period of time, I know like we've had situations where people have passed out in the middle of service. We've had diabetic emergencies. We've had broken bones. We've had, you name it, respiratory distress, do that. So here's some of the sort of events that we're talking about that could be likely events. It could be something as simple as a scraped knee. A kid comes in from, playground and they scrape their knee, or maybe they twisted an ankle. You may have someone that loses consciousness, and that could be for a variety of reasons, but they've lost consciousness. Diabetic emergency, a cardiac event that sort of gets into the more extreme, and a respiratory event extreme, but it does happen. You can read every day of just about every week somewhere in America, there's a church that experiences a pretty extreme medical emergency, a cardiac or respiratory arrest where people have to jump in. So what we're talking about is how do we lower our vulnerability? How do we better prepare ourselves for when that happens? Because it will happen eventually. How are we now, what typically happens in churches is we'll just figure it out when it happens, right? Like we know somebody in the church who's a nurse, or we know somebody who's this, and we just hope they're there when this happens, and we'll go grab them. And, there's a first aid kit somewhere in the building that probably hasn't been restocked since 1977. The Band-Aids don't even stick anymore. And so, but we'll just figure it out. That's just the plan. We'll figure it out. That's what we've always done. And I would just say to you, that's not a great plan, is just figure it out. You owe it, I would say, to your people to do better than that and to have a very clear plan. And one of the easiest ways to lower your vulnerability in this area is to develop a medical team for your church gatherings, for your church family. And so that's really what I want to spend a bulk of the time talking about and answering some of your questions on, is how do you go about informing and staffing and scheduling and equipping a medical team? So the first thing that I would say is this: chances are,
let me interrupt you real quick. I want to remind people to go ahead and ask questions when they have them. But one question people will always have is the slides that we've got tonight. I forgot to say, we have a spot on our website on our events tab at the bottom of because we count our webinars as events. At the bottom of our events tab is a whole list of all the documents from many of our webinars. Some of our webinars don't have slides, but many of them do. And so if you would like the slides, you don't have to be writing everything down as Phil goes through them. You could write it all down if you'd like for notes, but there'll be a link by the end of the week to the PDF of these slides on that on the bottom of our events tab on our website, waypointchurchpartners.com. And so you'll want to have that good, like that that vulnerability checklist is, where are we good, where are we bad, kind of almost red, yellow, green kind of thing on how we doing in each of these areas. You could do it, or have someone from the outside come in and do an assessment on how you're doing. And so those kind of things will be on that. So go ahead, Phil. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And one of the things I'll tell you is that, believe it or not, the federal government on some of their pages, and I can share some of those links, actually have some really good risk assessments for churches. There's some really good information. I don't know who they have doing their stuff in the last couple of years, but they've really upped their game on what they provide on their website and for houses of worship. I've been really, really impressed with it. Somebody's been listening and somebody knows what they're doing, and someone's very familiar with houses of worship. And so, we'll post some of those links. So you can do that sort of risk assessment. Let's talk a little bit about who should you look to or ask to be on your medical team. Really, this is going to be anyone who is has any sort of like medical background. You're really going to want to have someone more than, let's say, someone who just took a first aid class somewhere. I mean, those people are super helpful. And in a situation where that's all you have, or if you got multiple patients, then certainly that's who you're going to use. But to staff your medical team, what you're really going to want to do is go to your medical professionals in your church family. So this could be a variety of things. You've got EMTs, paramedics, RNs, LPNs, CNAs, so your nurses, a physician's assistant, a medical doctor, a respiratory therapist. The list could go on and on. But here at LifePoint, we have a medical team, and it is made up of a variety of people. We have quite a few, because of my connection, quite a few firefighters that come here and hang out with us on Sunday morning. And so actually the guy that oversees our medical team is a captain in the county fire department, and he oversees the team and makes sure they're scheduled and staff and that sort of thing. So you probably, and if you don't know who those people are, ask around of who they are, and then just once you know they are and you're serious about putting this team together, what I found is don't text, don't email, just walk up and have a conversation. That is the single most effective way that you can get someone to consider and join this team, is just to walk up to them and just say, hey, we're putting together a medical team, and I know you are a fill in the blank. Would you be interested in coming to an informational meeting? Would you be interested in knowing more about being a part of this team? So sort of the first step in this is putting together a list of potential people that could be on this team, and then having an informational meeting where you're going to kind of share what the vision for that team is going to be. And what I've found is it's in those informational meetings that you will begin to see who's really interested. And that's probably going to be some of your future leaders of that team, who really has sort of a heart for this. This is a great way to, maybe you have some folks in your church who are not plugged in any way. They won't serve in children's ministry. They don't play an instrument. They don't want to be a greeter, but they would love to be on a medical team and basically be on call whatever Sunday they're scheduled to be on call. So that's who you're looking for. And then once you kind of identify those people, you're going to approach them, you're going to invite them to it, you're going to tell them a little bit about it, and then you're going to have an informational meeting of some sort where you're just going to kind of cast the vision. This is what we hope for this team. While you're doing that, what we found helpful is grab some of those key players in there, and the next thing you want to do is sort of, once as you're assembling the team, before you officially have a team, you may even want to do this before you do your information meeting, is you need to put together a really good, reasonable SOP. And here's the reason why I say reasonable SOP. I saw in the chat that some of you are in here have an emergency management background. You will have some overzealous people on the team. And what I mean by that is they'll go, can we start IVs? Can we intubate? Can we crack their chest? Can we, it's like, they're just like, they see this is the opportunity to use the skill sets that they have acquired over the years to put it to use in the church, to serve God and God's people with this thing. And so I say reasonable because really all this team is doing, they're not, if you guys are familiar with, some of you are watching probably know the difference between BLS, basic life support, and ALS, advanced life support. This is very much a BLS operation. All you're doing is controlling bleeds and sort of stabilizing until the medics on the ambulance with all the ALS equipment, all that stuff can get there. That's really what you're doing, which, by the way, is going to be part of your SOP, is who's calling 911. If it's a situation where someone needs to call 911, someone needs to be designated like, hey, or that person in charge needs to say, I need you to dial 911 while I work on this patient. And so what you're going to do is you're going to put together a really good SOP. let me just say this, an SOP, a really good SOP will protect you legally. It'll protect you liability wise. If someone tries to do some sort of advanced life support and something happens, our SOP clearly states they weren't supposed to do that. So you're going to put together an SOP. Our SOP is like a page and a half long. It does not need to be 20 pages long. Ours is pretty simple. And if you're interested, I'll be happy to share that with you. We're actually in the process of revamping that a little bit. But that's create your SOP. Once you've sort of assembled your people, and once you've created a really good SOP that everyone agrees on, what you're going to want to do next is you got to start assembling your gear. So you got your people, you got 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 people who are like, I'm in, I'll do this. I want to be on this team. You got a really solid SOP. Now you're going to start assembling the gear that you need. And again, you don't need a whole bunch of like heart monitors and ET tubes and things like that, laryngoscopes. Some of you watching again, you know exactly what I'm talking about. What you're going to need is, we're going to talk about some things here, is let's talk about just a good first aid kit. I put some sources on here. I could have listed 100, but these are some of the top ones that are out there. Let me just say this. Don't go buy a $20 first aid kit from Walmart. Okay. Don't go and buy the cheapest thing out there. A good medic bag is going to cost you some money. Even the bag itself, you want to be made of, it's durable, it's good material, it's going to last you a long time. Have good supplies in it. Don't have the cheapest Band-Aids and the cheapest Ace bandage. And I don't get into this here because I wasn't sure how much time we're gonna have, but we even have a list of what goes in our bag. So, I mean, basically it's really good Band-Aids and gauze, pads, 4x4s, things of that nature. Ace bandages, things of that nature. You got to be careful with some of the other stuff, like Tylenol and stuff like that. I would encourage you to be very careful in having any kind of medication in your first aid kit. It opens you to liability. Let's say you give someone some medication and they're allergic to it and they didn't know it. Or it gets into an area that you probably don't want to get into. There are some things out there like EpiPens and stuff like that. Again, I would encourage you not to have a church EpiPen in the bag. If someone's allergic to bee stings or peanuts and stuff like that, they're going to carry their own. And again, for liability purposes, use theirs. That's where you ALS versus BLS, that sort of thing. So first aid kits. MyMedic.com makes a lot. They tend to be a little more rugged. So for like outdoor events, if you got a ball field or that sort of thing, or you go on a camping trip, MyMedic, my bag that stays in my vehicle, my kit is a MyMedic bag. Lightning, you can go on Amazon and type in Lightning Medic or first aid kits, and you're going to find a whole bunch of different types. North American Rescue Calls, Amazon. You just type in Google first aid kits. My biggest thing would be don't buy the cheap, and don't buy stuff you don't need. And if you're not sure what you need and what you don't need, talk to somebody. I'll be happy to help you with that. Or if you don't have someone in your church family that can help you along that. So first aid kits, that's what you're going to need. I'm going to show you ours here in a moment in one of our slides. And then once you get a really good first aid kit, something else you got to think about is getting every church building, every single campus out there should have an AED. Do not tell me I can't because they're too expensive. You can't afford not to have one, is what I say. There's grants out there. They're a little bit hard to get. I'm just going to tell you, they're not super easy, but sometimes you can find them. Sometimes your local Walmart will do like a nonprofit grant, and you can use it to buy an AED. AEDs are going to cost you anywhere from $800 to $1,600. I'm going to encourage you to get a non-refurbished $1,200 to $1,600 AED. $800 AEDs tend to be older generations, sometimes refurbished. If that's all you can do, then that's fine. Here's some places you can go to: American AED, HeartSmart.com, MedUSA, Ultra. So I put in here Ultra Medical. One of the things that is a sort of a trend we're seeing with AEDs is leasing AEDs. That's kind of new, where you can lease them for as little as $60, $75 a month. And every 3 to 5 years, you get a brand new AD. So you're not spending the $1,600 and also they make sure the maintenance, the batteries, you can even pay a little bit more and have monitoring on the AED. So when you open the AED up, it'll automatically dial 911 for you. We don't have that, but that is available out there. So get you a good AED. If your building's large enough, you should have more than one AED. At our campus, we're about 20,000 square feet, and we have 2 AEDs, one in the kids area and one in our worship space.
Go for the novice. Remind us what an AED is. Oh boy, it's an external defibrillator, automatic external defibrillator. Good gracious, okay. I should know that like easily. I've been in like a million classes in CPR and AED, but it's a defibrillator. It's if someone's going into cardiac arrest, you would hook up these pads to them, and then it says automatic because that's literally you press a button, you step back, and the thing begins to talk and says, please wait, analyzing, and it'll analyze, and please clear, shock advised, and then you'll shock them. It walks you through it. It's pretty dummy proof. So you're going to want that. Guys and gals on ambulances, we carry something that's like that, but it's far more complex. But this is sort of dummy proof. The other thing that I really want to make sure I stress on here, and make sure I make this really loud and clear for everyone, be sure when you order an AED that you order a set of pediatric patches, a pediatric kit, because it's going to automatically come with adult patches that you put on for defibrillation. But all of the major manufacturers make pediatric kits as well, and they're smaller. And the way that they're designed is to give what is the proper amount of shock for a child. And they'll tell you like 6 and under, or they'll give you a weight and under. No one wants to think about that situation of a pediatric cardiac arrest. I've been on those calls. It's high stress. Nobody enjoys those. But having the right equipment in that situation. I mean, we just saw what happened with Hamlin. I mean, a strike, a blow to the chest sent him into, sudden cardiac arrest, right? You probably have sporting events or youth group or whatever. I mean, again, highly unlikely. We go back to that frequency thing, low frequency. But you may have some older people in your church that have cardiac issues, or even younger people that have cardiac issues. So have the adult kit for the AED and spend the extra money. It's going to cost you about $200 or $300 additional for the pediatric kit to go in there. We keep ours together. So when you open our AEDs up, the adult kit's there for patches, and then the pediatric is there as well. And it'll walk you through it. And that gets into training, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So that's AEDs. The next thing is radios. Every safety team, and we don't use the term security, we use safety team, but we have a safety team and we have a medical team. Those are 2 separate teams. Our safety team is in charge of sort of monitoring any sort of, we'll use the term threat, and that sort of thing. They're kind of monitoring the space. And then we have a medical team. They work closely together, but they're not the same. We have radios. Our medical team has radios. You don't have to spend a ton of money on radios. In fact, I would encourage you not to spend. I mean, you can spend $2,000 a radio. Don't. You can spend $100 for radios. Maybe spend a little bit more. Here's some different ones that are out there. We use the Cobra PX 655. It's multi-channel. So like our safety teams on channel 1, our children's ministries on channel 2, our parking teams on channel 3, and then our staff is on channel 4. So medical and safety are both on 2. This is just an easy way to communicate. No one's going to want to be shouting and calling back and forth, and the people are coordinating. Because if you got a really good SOP, when you're dialing 911, somebody from your team should be going out to meet the ambulance and probably an engine that's coming as well, and just giving them a quick sort of situation report, like, hey, it's a 30-year-old female. We don't know what's wrong with her. She just all of a sudden passed out. Her husband's here and says that she's had some diabetic issues, like that sort of thing. Give that sort of briefing. That's
the radio is going to help you with that sort of communication and make sure that everything is coordinated. So just really encourage those are the three big things. Make sure you have a really good first class BLS first aid kit. Make sure you have a good AED. Make sure with pediatric and adult pads, make sure you have radios that you can communicate with each other. And it may be the radio thing. If you're not using radios in your on your church campus, this may be a great opportunity to loop. If you get a multi-channel radio, so like, hey, we're going to put this ministry on this channel and this ministry on that channel, and it will just increase your effectiveness instead of hollering. It also allows you to be a little bit discreet. You're not hollering information across the room or running around. You can do that. So that's what equipment you're going to need. Something else you're going to need. You're going to want to have a really good incident report form. Every time you respond to a situation, you should have someone fill out an incident report form. Maybe you have an ouch report in your children's ministry, but every time that medical team touches. So for those of you that are on here that have a fire and EMS background, you know we have an incident report. Every time we run a call, we got to write everything down. We got to come in. We got to put it on the computer. If we don't put it in right, someone calls us to tell us we didn't put it in there right. But everything for liability purposes, this protects you if someone says, I mean, it could run the gamut of an insurance claim to someone saying, hey, this happened and I don't think it should have happened. So make sure you have a really good incident form. We have some of those as well that, again, we'll be happy to share. But again, you can Google church medical incident form and find probably 100 examples. And your insurance, if you guys have Brotherhood, or what's the other Guardian? What is it?
Church Mutuals one, Brotherhood Mutuals one.
Brotherhood. Brotherhood, I'm going to speak up for Brotherhood real quick. They do a really, really good job of providing some really, really good resources on their website. So I bet you there's an incident report form on their site that you can check out. Then you use. So you can have your SOP. What we do is we attach the incident report form to the SOP. So that's with the bag. When you go to the bag, there's an incident report form. That person's going to fill that out. Our staff's going to get a copy of that. We're going to keep a copy of that just in case something comes up down the road for insurance or legal purposes. So really good incident report form. The next thing here is, and I'm watching our time, is make highly visible. This is a picture of what we do at LifePoint, and you don't have to do this, but a medical team that is scheduled every week should sit in the same place every single week. And everyone from your children's ministry to your teen ministry to your worship team, everyone should know where this person is. This is the way we did ours. This lady actually sewed and made that little medic cover for that chair. And then you see the bag that's underneath it. Everyone knows, by the way, the AED is located just to the right of there. You can't see it. It's just around the corner. But everyone knows you don't sit in that chair. That's for whoever the medical call is or the medics on call, depending on the size of the event. And that's where you go if you need something. So make sure they have reserved seating. Make sure everyone knows where that's at. And make sure that all of your ministries, again, know where to go if there's an issue. Our children's ministry, we encourage them, don't throw a Band-Aid. If someone gets hurt, come get the medical team. Just automatically come get the medical team. And then we have others who are on call. So we have an incident that's large enough that requires multiple people, then everyone else sort of jumps in from that team. Then when should they be present? That's the next slide here. Our people on our medical team are there Sunday mornings. They're there for large events like VBS, Christmas Eve, you name it. They're there. Work days, someone might get hurt. They're there. And then the last thing on here, I want to make sure we leave time for Q&A, is training. This team should meet regularly. Provide CPR training. If they're medical professionals, they're probably already getting CPR training at some level. They're probably already getting AED training. But even just having that team together to go through the bag, inspect it, make sure they're familiar with what's in there, running through just scenarios. They don't need to spend hours and hours. They don't need to meet every week. But even if it's just quarterly, they get together to go, hey, if this happens, this is what we're doing. It's also good if someone feels open to share with you maybe a medical need they have, is making sure that you share that with their permission. So let's say someone in the church goes, hey, I just need you to know I have this thing, and we've had this happen where they'll walk over to the medic thing. I have this thing. We just let other people, because that person's there every week. Just, hey, just know, Clarence, he sometimes, has shortness of breath or whatever that might be. And so you sort of learn that there's no HIPAA violation there. But just in communicating with each other, you'll just do your job better. So, and that all going back to the beginning will lower your vulnerability on what is the highest frequency event you will face in your church gathering, whose impact could be significant.
All right. Well, I think it's huge, Phil, that you said part of this is it's having a whole team of people that get to serve their church in a way that they're already equipped for. That there's so many people that are serving in an area that's kind of a new area for them, but for people that have a medical background, of all the ways that people can have a medical background to be able to serve their church, they're going to be so thrilled about that. And some churches sometimes have a hard time figuring out great places to put everybody to make them feel like they're owners of the church rather than just attenders. And so to have not just a person, it's not just Nancy that sits in that chair every week, but have a team that's on rotation once a month or whatever your rotation is, that they feel like they're part of a team, that they're going to meet quarterly together. When you say quarterly, is that a Sunday before church? Is it Saturday morning? What's your quarterly?
So
I'm curious your safety team as well. When they meet, when's that look like, and how long do they meet?
So typically it's gonna be a Sunday afternoon. And sometimes that's going to be a joint meeting with the two. Sometimes that's just going to be just the medical team. Kind of extrapolating this out further, like one of the things that we're preparing for in just a couple of months is we do drills. Like we're doing an evacuation drill on a Sunday morning at the end of our service. And our medical team and our safety team and our children's ministry team are all a part of that. We're going to practice evacuating the building and reuniting children with their parents in a way that is safe. So reunification checkpoints, which is a whole other topic, but that medical team and that safety team will be a part of that. And so they're a part of, typically what we'll do is the head of the medical team. That person might be at some of those safety teams and some of the other more high level meetings versus the entire membership medical team.
Yeah. All right.
Just making sure they're in the loop, just making sure they're aware.
Yeah, and it's just with the fact that you feel like, oh, we've covered this last year or less, but just the fact that the team meets together makes them feel like they're part of the team. There's accountability on, we're all unified on what we're supposed to do, and so you've got to have someone that cares about the rhythm that your regular training goes,
Right.
so that you're not kind of lax in that. And then if something were to happen, people are going, what did we say we were going to do? What's our SOP? And if you just walk through the SOP as a meeting, that's a great format for reminding everybody, okay, here's if something happens, here's what we're going to do. And then everybody goes, got it. And then you're good. You could do obviously extra training than that on particular scenarios or whatever, but don't be lax in keeping your team equipped to do the ministry that they've been invited to be part of at your church. So that's really great. I'm curious if anybody has any other questions. We had one that Kyle McGinnis asked, but I think we answered his question without working at it. Bob Chauncey, we will put in our email tomorrow that goes out about how Homeland Security will do assessments for your church. And there's a link for that we'll provide for you. So thanks, Bob, for highlighting that. But if there's any other questions that you have for Phil about putting your medical team together, he's covered just about everything. Phil, I can tell you that what I'm seeing in churches on a regular basis is typically at least the scheduling of the medical team is done with the safety team, just so that there's coordination on one person's keeping track of everybody in the building. And often it's even, if you think about it, that your first impressions team keeps in concert with the safety team, because your people in your parking lot are your first line of defense of just looking for somebody that looks odd as they're walking in the building.
That is your forward-leaning. Yeah, that's your forward-leaning radar. Is your greeters and your parking team. They should detect. One thing I did want to mention. We're talking about these medical teams that people need to train for, to be prepared for it, and that is the complexities of when you have a medical emergency in a large group situation, there's some dynamics at play there that you can train through as well. And what I mean by that is, typically, like let's say for a firefighter and medic, when we show up on the scene, there may be a patient and one family member, right? It's fairly controlled. Sometimes a few family members, it's controlled. When these things happen, sometimes you may have dozens, hundreds of people standing around. And where that sort of gets complex is, what if you have a whole bunch of people who go, well, I know first aid. Well, I know this. Well, people who really want to help and they mean well, but you got to have someone there who kind of goes, hey, I appreciate that. And if I need you, I'll let you know, but we got this. And so in that situation, I saw Karen ask a question here. What size congregation are you talking about? Our church has about 40 to 60 people regularly on a Sunday morning. I think any size church, whether obviously if you're a larger church, there's probably a larger pool to pull from and you could probably staff it easier. But even if you have 40 to 60 people, you probably have a couple of medical professionals in that group, and they're probably there every other, if not every Sunday. Even if you just ask someone like, hey, do you mind just if we bought a really nice first aid kit, and even like invite them to buy it? And if we bought an AED, and again, I don't care if you got 20 people, get a first aid kit, get an AED. And would you mind that if something happened that we would be able to just call on you, like that you would be our person that we'd look to? They'd probably appreciate that ask. But I think regardless of what size you are, this is a very doable, scalable ministry.
Well, and I could say, and that's a great question, Karen. Thanks for asking. But we hear about the events that happen, and all the events that happen in churches are not necessarily in large churches. Is that medical emergency probably proportionately, I hate to say it this way, but there's proportionally more elderly people in some older, even country congregations. And so some of the medical emergencies that we see are related to that. And so so being prepared with some kind of a plan rather than we'll figure it out is really important. You may not have 12, 15 people to put in a rotation on a team of 3 or 4 people, but having some kind of plan that says if something happens, this is what we're going to do. That's the key that you have there. Let's see. All right. So yeah, and I can tell you, I am seeing more, but I very rarely do I see AEDs in churches. Even though I'm seeing medical teams. Of course, if you have a medical team, you're going to start seeing those a little bit more obvious. They have those chairs. There's more and more churches where I see the chair designated for the medical team volunteer. But every church needs to have an AED. Just
yeah.
guaranteed.
And again, there's grants out there that you could, that you could work through to get those. We tried that. It was so complicated for us. Honestly, it was like, let's just go ahead and buy them and have them. Cause it was like, this takes 6 to 8 months to figure out, but that money is out there. And again, if you can't shell out $1,600, maybe you can do the lease program for $50 a month.
Which I didn't know that. That's great news as an option for churches not to have to pay for it all at one time, and to get a new one every 2-3 years would be awesome.
You would just hate to have a situation like that, especially with a kid, but an adult as well, where, like if we just had, and some churches are right around the corner from a fire station. The response time might be 15, 20 minutes, and that's far too long. And let me just sort of drop back. Even if you don't have a medical team, you should provide, like if you have a children's ministry, like train them in CPR. Train your greeters in CPR. Like if you're like, well, we can't put together a medical team, it takes too long. It does not cost much to just train your people, and just some of those simple medical things that could absolutely save a life. So it doesn't have to be just your medical team. We're getting ready to have a CPR class for our children's ministry and for our teen ministry. And that's completely separate from our medical teams, just because we value that and we think that's important. So yeah.
Yeah, my wife was a longtime children's minister, and she did, I think, annual training, if not every other year, that for her children's ministry. But her children's ministry leaders she usually had 3 or 4 people who were captains. It was kind of required for them.
It should be.
To,
I mean, it absolutely
to
should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're responsible.
Yeah,
No one
we
else is
had,
responsible. We are responsible.
so we are just about out of time. I do want to share one final thing. I want to thank Phil for being with us tonight, and more than anything, to knowing that we've got a resource here that's part of the Waypoint Network that's really qualified to try to answer your questions in a really practical way. But this has been our topic for tonight, has been about safety and particularly in medical emergencies. The next couple of months, I want to tell you about the events that we've got coming up on a webinar that may not be your area of ministry, but we find that our best, as is typical, inviting a friend to church is the best way to get someone to church. The best way to get people on our webinars is from someone to invite them from their church. And so next month, we do a couple a year for your missions team. So one is real practical ways you can be caregivers for the children of your missionaries. And so that's coming up in a month. And then we do 2 a year for elder training. And so in a couple of months, in April, we're going to be doing one about elder covenants, what they look like, why to have them. And so we're going to have a panel of people who've worked with those. And so elders can view that webinar, hopefully live, and talk about, do you have a covenant? Should you have one? And if so, how would you pull that together and make it useful for your elders to be a stronger team? And so I do want to tell you very quickly, and we're about out of time, our next big live event that we're having in person is coming up next month. It's called The Art of the Sermon. And so you may not be the preacher at your church, but your preacher needs to come to this event. And so we have 5 venues coming up in the month of March. You can see on the map here which one would be nearest to you. But we would love for your preacher to come to the Art of Sermon, where we've got great experienced preachers that just talk about how they preach. And we've been doing this for 12 years now. It's great every year. And so I want to invite you to that. And the flip side of that is not only do we have webinars every month, but we also have a Waypoint podcast that comes out every other week. And so it's been going a couple of years, got about 50 plus episodes, leaders in our region mostly, and giving real good insight and encouragement on ministry. And so this is something that you can listen to. You can subscribe to that on whatever podcast platform you happen to use if you're a podcast person. And we've also got one that's growing, and actually the listenership of this is huge, is the Pastor's Wife podcast. And so between the 2 of those podcasts, we had 5,000 downloads last year of people listening to the one or the other of those podcasts during the year. They drop every other week. You can listen to them when they drop, when you subscribe, or I travel a lot, so I'll listen to 2 or 3 at a time while I'm traveling on the road. But we want to support and encourage ministry leaders in our region. And so that's why we have this webinar series and the podcast series, is to encourage you, equip you to lead the church well. And Phil said this earlier, and I know what he meant is he said you owe it to your church. And it's like, you don't owe it to your church, but is there anything that we should be more dedicated to than the bride of Christ? If we've been asked to serve and lead the bride of Christ, we have to give it our best. And so whatever area of ministry you are serving in, if there's any way that we can help you serve in that area with excellence and dedication and feeling empowered and equipped, we'd love to do that. So thanks for joining us tonight or later on demand. And we invite you to look for other areas on the YouTube channel on way that we can help encourage and support your area of ministry. Phil, thanks for joining us as usual tonight. Great stuff.